Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and I'm once again joined by my great friend, Peter Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How you doing, Pete?
I'm doing fine, John. John, one of the things I've never asked you about, and we've been friends for a few years. So on your left arm, you have a number of tattoos.
Yes.
Again, because I've never had a tattoo, I don't know if people who get tattoos, if they feel comfortable sort of revealing the backstory, or is it kind of something you keep inside of you?
No, I reveal
Tell us,
stories.
tell us something about one of your tattoos on your arms here that would intrigue our audience.
Wow, that's a great question. This tiger head, I actually got that in St. Louis at a shop that was had its lineage back to the 1930s with Burt Grimm, and he actually tattooed American soldiers who were stationed at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And this is one of his original drawings from like the 40s. So I went to the same shop that's been doing this same tattoo for like all those years. But when I said I want a Burt Grimm tattoo, they're like, "You want a what?" And I'm like, "I want a Burt Grimm tattoo." And they're like, "No one ever comes in and asks us for a Burt Grimm tattoo." And I'm like, "Well, I'm a historian, so I kind of want a historical tattoo." So that was a old one, but they think that he probably tattooed over 10,000 soldiers while he was in St. Louis.
Good God.
Yeah, he made a lot of money. Yeah.
Well, this evening we have with us Ben Roy, a student at Gettysburg College. And Ben, I believe, has no tattoos, but Ben, you be sure to tell your parents when you come back, Gettysburg College this fall for classes, you get from us for being on the show. It's a gift certificate, $10 off for your first tattoo at General Pickett's Tattoo Parlor.
That's right. That's right. How's that sound, Ben?
Ben?
That sounds awesome. I'm thinking about getting some face tat or, something on my hands.
Go Mike Tyson on us if you want, whatever you want,
Yeah.
right? You could get, I believe your favorite president is Millard Fillmore. I think you said that to me once. You could get Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is not, we have a bad research team, Ben. We discovered that last week. We had someone from Ohio State, and we thought he was a Michigan. So tell us your favorite president.
Oh,
It's Franklin Pierce. It's Franklin Pierce. And I give a shout out to my grandmother, who is the president of the Pierce Brigade. She's the superintendent of Franklin Pierce's home in Concord, New Hampshire. And I worked there. And I actually once did interpretation as Franklin Pierce. I talked at the house and interpreted Franklin Pierce's life. And he's one of the more misunderstood presidents, commonly stereotyped as a dough face, but I like to always rep for Franklin Pierce. He was a close friend of Nathaniel Hawthorne. He had a very interesting life, fought in the Mexican-American War, but you're close with Millard Fillmore. He is, but I think Franklin Pierce gets a little bit more fame just because he's more hated.
Right. So the people you gave this talk to at the home, are these people who are just driving along the road and are like, "Oh, we need a bathroom break." They stop and then, "Hey, wait, well, we're here. Let's let this nice young boy tell us about Franklin Pierce."
wow.
That's tough, isn't it?
No,
It's
it was
salty as
it was part of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the city of Concord, New Hampshire, and our interpretive event was a part of that celebration. So I had a short 15-minute talk ready, and I talked about his life and his experiences, his presidency. He was a dark horse, one-term president. So yeah, no, we had a bunch of locals, people who love Concord.
You're saying people weren't pouring in from outside of New Hampshire to come to this. And that's okay. Just wanted to get that clear.
What are you implying about Concord, New Hampshire? What are you implying, Dr. Carmichael?
They're pouring in from Portsmouth.
I'm just
That's where
curious.
they're pouring in from.
So Ben obviously grew up in New Hampshire, but after your first year, or during your first year, your family moved to North Carolina, not so far from Hendersonville, North Carolina. That's not the town though. Where's your family at these days?
We're living in Bostic, North Carolina right now, but a small suburb of Bostic. It's Golden Valley. It's about 45 minutes from the nearest grocery store. So we're way out in the middle of nowhere, hoping the Wi-Fi holds out throughout all of this.
We do as well. So tell us, what was the big cultural adjustment that you had to make from New England to North Carolina?
Oh, well, just the prevalence of biscuits everywhere all the time. But people are very, very good down here. There's just they can be a little bit hard to understand, but they generally speak so slowly. I shouldn't speak in stereotypes, but they speak so slowly.
Well, it's
Usually,
a different sort of dialect or slang. There's no doubt. Yeah, it takes, but it's a beautiful. I mean, there's nothing like a North Carolina accent. I spent a lot of time in
yes.
North Carolina. My daughter, born in North Carolina, of course they both were, but one of them, she kept her North Carolina accent for a while, even when we got here to Pennsylvania. And of course, it saddened me the day that it disappeared. I like a good North Carolina accent and good
It is
North Carolina barbecue, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
But Bostic actually has a presidential connection as well, just like Concord, New Hampshire. Bostic, North Carolina claims to be the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. Apparently there was Sally Hemings was from not Sally Hemings, Abraham Lincoln's mother was from around this region, and there's some that Abraham Lincoln could have been born here in Bostic, North Carolina. And there's a Bostic Lincoln Center that explains all of it. I don't know when it's open. It's definitely not open now, but they claim Abraham.
Right. Everyone wants to capitalize off old Abe, don't they? Everyone does.
Yeah. Either.
Let me just say a little
George
bit.
Washington.
Or George Washington. That's right.
Yeah.
Let me say a little bit more about Ben. Ben, again, a rising senior at Gettysburg College, history major. He's also a public history minor as well as Civil War era studies. I have a little mug here that promotes that minor. He's doing all three. And during the summers, he's had a range of experiences. He worked at Minuteman Park, where he was an interpreter at Lexington and Concord for an entire summer. Last summer, Ben and I spent some time together while he worked on a research project. And Ben, I'm going to let you actually give the summary of it, but it's one that took him to the great state of Indiana and to Indiana University, where he did some research at the Lilly Library. And he'll tell us a little bit about his project, but I should note that Ben is the first student at Gettysburg College to receive a Beinecke Award. A Beinecke Award is a very prestigious award. It's one that will give Ben financial support for graduate school, which is truly shocking when, in fact, he hasn't even applied or been accepted, which we're all banking that will happen. He has I think, a very promising career ahead of him, as do so many of my other students. He is part of one of the stronger cohorts of students that I've ever had in all of my years teaching at Gettysburg College. So this summer, he is going to Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Park. And so if you show up, I suspect Ben will tell you a little bit about the battlefield there, but hell, slip him $1 or $5 and he'll tell you, what will you give him? You'll talk to him all about the great heroes of New Hampshire. Will you not?
Yes.
Just a little added bonus. So Ben,
the 5th New Hampshire did get closest to the wall at Fredericksburg.
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness. Here
we go.
Here it comes.
Here we go. Yeah. All right. So Ben, tell us a little bit about your project last summer, and then I will give a little bit of background before our topic for tonight.
Sure. Yeah. So, and thank you for the congratulations on the Beinecke. Yeah, and I think we're all. It's a strange one. Yeah, that they released the funding and everything before you actually get into graduate school. So we all have our fingers crossed. But thank you again. And but yeah, my Colby Summer Fellowship research was specifically oriented towards student understandings of manhood before the American Civil War among college students, and kind of talking about how there's the relationship between students, faculty, and the home, because manhood at that time was understood as linked to independence, economic independence. And of course, these students, they're obsessed with manhood, and they're all male except for the female academies, but they're obsessed with attaining the manhood status, but they're not yet independent. They are at college. So that kind of makes both the students and the faculty, but also their parents as well, because their parents are releasing them into the control and authority of the faculty. And that's what I really focused my research on is talking about that relationship, but also carrying it forward into how the lessons they learned in the classroom at Indiana University. A lot of these students later served as officers in the Union Army, and talking about how the lessons they learned in the classroom translated onto the battlefield, and in particular in their relationship with their men. And the final product of that research, a short paper that I translated into a presentation, was accepted for the 2020 Maxey Undergraduate Research Conference at Johns Hopkins, which unfortunately was subsequently canceled because of the COVID pandemic. But there should be an online platform where all of the presentations will be available to view. And, my friend Cam Sowers, he got accepted to the same program, so I think you'll be able to view his research up there as well. But yeah, it was a great opportunity, and you know, a unique one through Gettysburg College, and learned a lot. Went out to the great state of Indiana, spent a little bit of time out there.
You didn't get to stop by and see my mom. She would have loved to have seen you. You spent right back to Indianapolis. Everyone needs to get the Charlotte Carmichael treatment.
Yeah.
It was just a quick 3-day trip, so I didn't have much time, but we just got in and got out.
Let me say again about Ben's trajectory in terms of his interest and how they've expanded since he's been at Gettysburg is a trajectory that I see a number of students follow. And it's one in which, you know, they come here with this deep and passionate interest in traditional military history, which has been a topic here on our show. And that, of course, I don't think is dissipated at all for Ben. But Ben has come to understand and appreciate that if you are going to find the deep meaning of what these men made of going through the ordeal of battle, one has to look at their pre-war years. One has to take seriously their intellectual life. One also has to have a deep understanding of the cultural world that they inhabited. And I've seen in a short period of time, Ben's creativity and his intellectual curiosity have really taken off. And I will say, as Ben's already alluded to, only at Gettysburg College, we do what we can do for students at the undergraduate level. It'd be hard to replicate anywhere else. Location, location, location. That says it all. But tonight we're going to talk about Ben's other interest that he has developed while here. He's also worked with Professor Ian Isherwood, who is a Gettysburg alum, I might add. Professor Isherwood is a scholar of World War I, and he's published a book, of course, as we all do, but he also has done the Peers Project, which all of you should take the time, our viewers, to look it up. And I have already forgotten Peers' first name. What is Peers' first name?
His nickname was Jack, but his full name was Hugh John Chevalier Peers, which is just a fantastic British name.
If you have a name like that, you can't help but to have a little bit of attitude when you grow up, right? But we'll call him Jack. Jack Peers. The Jack Peers Project is something that all of you should look up. It's just brilliantly done. It's based largely, I believe, on Piers's diary. One of Piers's descendants was actually a student of mine, and Ian and the student got together, and the rest is history, as they say. Now, so Ben has a deep interest in World War I. He was in France last fall when he was studying in England. And so I'd like to sort of start there, and then John will jump in. John is certainly more of an expert than I am about World War I, although I have a passion for it, there's no doubt. So Ben, you finally made it to Europe, across the pond, and you get to go to the battlefields of the Somme. And you're walking the Somme, and you're seeing those battlefields. I want you to sort of recreate, not sort of, I want you to recreate the feelings, your thoughts as you walk the Somme, and then how you started to then juxtapose that place with your understanding of the Civil War based on your time here at the Gettysburg battlefield.
Sure. Yeah. And it was definitely one of the highlights of my experience abroad. And I was in a very, very good place to do it. Of course, being a student at Gettysburg, you spend a lot of time going around the battlefield, but I've been to a lot of other American battlefields, both of the Civil War and the American Revolution. But I think the thing that struck me the most about the battlefields in France is just their size and how far you can see. So I think that's one of the major contrasts between the First World War and the American Civil War is just the size of the military operations. The fronts are miles and miles and miles long. So of course I didn't go to the whole Battle of the Somme. That would be impossible in just a day. I went to just a couple battlefields and places like Beaumont and Mel. And I think that was really one of the things that struck me, was that there was just this tremendous tragedy could happen in one place. The 1st Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment went into action, absolutely decimated in this one place. And there are contrasts to that in the American Civil War, regiments like the 1st Minnesota. But on these battlefields, something like that happens on July 1st, and then something like that happens again 2 weeks later. Another battalion is decimated. And then something happens like that 2 months later in November, when I think it's the 15th Scottish Division attacks, and whole battalions are wiped out again in the exact same place. And I think that kind of just, that loss that happens in one small geographic location that's also extrapolated over 5 miles of frontage, that is what really struck me about the difference between a First World War battlefield and an American battlefield. And the other part of it was just purely geographic. I think I have a lot of emphasis on environmental history in my past studies and everything like that. And of course, we don't want to say that environmental factors control military factors totally. But I think that was the biggest thing that hit me right off the bat. As soon as I walked out of the train station, on the Somme, you can see for miles and miles, the forests have been cleared for thousands of years. And when there are small, woodlots, they stick out like sore thumbs. And I remember as I was walking, I could see the Tietval Memorial, which is a huge memorial to the missing, centered around the village of Tietval on the Somme. And it's just about 3 stories high. And over my shoulder, it was, no bigger than my thumb. And you can see that far. Whereas on a battlefield like Gettysburg, or even relatively open ones like Antietam, they're pretty well fenced in. You're very limited in your vision. And I think that's just by virtue of the geography of the United States versus France. But I think just that kind of contrast gave me, to kind of speak about in a comparative aspect, it gave me really a great perspective on just how large the First World War was, but then how small the Civil War is by comparison, if that makes any sense. That like I said, it's happening on miles and miles of frontage.
I just quickly, and then let John jump in. Let me talk about the scale. I remember when I visited the Somme, one of the mines that was detonated by the British left a crater that, of course, makes the crater at Petersburg look like a small sand trap. Mm-hmm. And the way to get a sense of the scale of that crater is I took a picture of it, and our tour bus looked like a little Matchbox car. It was that tiny, that small. It was really pretty astonishing. Although I'll quickly say, I can't help myself. And then John, you can take it over.
That's okay.
The operations of Petersburg and Richmond in 1864, stretching from Richmond all the way down across the James, south of Petersburg, stretched damn near close to 30 miles. Just saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, you can't see them all in one place, but still a pretty big operation.
Yeah. For that time period, that's a huge operation. Yeah. And Earl Hess does a great job talking about that in all of his work, especially with earthworks and such. Ben, I have to ask you, when you were there and you were thinking about the men who were on the line and who at those points had tried to cross those ridges and blew up those mines and stuff like that, did anything harken to you about the similarities in unit cohesiveness, or men pushing each other on, through their friends or right next to them, especially in the BEF with like PALS battalions and stuff like that? Did that ever cross your mind as being comparative with Civil War units where they're all from the same town or the same school even?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually one thing I've been doing a lot of research on in a lot of my coursework, not correlated, but simultaneously researching kind of unit pride in the American Civil War and unit pride within the BEF. And there are a lot of surprising similarities. And I should say, after the Somme in 1916, the British Army does consciously try to move away from the PAL battalion and kind of that local unit cohesiveness, because it just proved so disastrous for these localities back home in Great Britain. But yeah, I did see a stunning amount of similarities just in the way that units developed that pride and the sense of themselves and the way they related to each other. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was the creation of unit hierarchies based on combat experience. So in both armies, and I think it's something that historians kind of tend to disregard in their studies, both armies had definite ideas of this is a good division, or this is a good regiment or a corps in the American Civil War, and this is a bad one. You know, these are ones that can be relied on, these are ones that can't. And I think in both First World War studies and in American Civil War studies, there's been a lot of work recently to kind of exonerate those units that got that reputation. I think of the 11th Corps in particular. You know, a lot of historians work to kind of show that these guys didn't really deserve the reputation that they got. They were a victim of circumstance and so on. But I think it's very easy to take that perspective and then take one step down and start saying that, well, okay, if that reputation of maybe not an elite unit or maybe not a dependable unit is false, then maybe the whole idea of an elite unit is kind of bankrupt in itself. And I think that kind of feeds off the narrative of the common soldier, that, you know, whenever we talk about what it was like to be a soldier in either the BEF or the American Civil War, we start talking about the common soldier's experience. And I think that tends to level the idea of elite units and kind of just how important it was to be a part of, you know, I'm in the 8th Queens, for instance, and we're from this locality. I'm in the 5th New Hampshire and we're from Concord, New Hampshire. And I think that kind of common soldier narrative and the push to kind of against and away from elite units tends to minimize that. But my research has found, of course, that to these guys, that was all important. The unit that you were in was all important. And it, in a lot of instances, it was very, very important to the guys commanding them. You know, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig in 1918, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, Mr. Heckman, they just threw the Canadian Corps over and over and over again against the Germans, and the same with the Australians. And it was much the same way during the American Civil War. Grant and Sherman, he took his best elements of the army with him to the sea, and he left everyone else behind. So if the soldiers themselves believe that they belong to an elite unit, and the commanders believe that they belong to an elite unit, aren't they more or less an elite unit? Which is just something I've been thinking about and kind of chewing over with my mind. And I'm curious what you guys think of that, kind of the elite unit, that kind of mentality, which I think tends to get kind of ignored by historians.
Well, I would just say what I think it's ignored is how loaded the word elite is. Right? So what do we really mean when you say a unit's elite? What we really mean is they're really good at killing. And that, right. What it gets obscured by is we say elite and then we think they had sort of an esprit de corps, they had a great cohesiveness, they had a great sense of pride, and they probably did have all those things. But at the end of the day, the word killing and elite has to be, right, they're inseparable. When we say they were effective on the battlefield, what we mean is they were good at killing. And I'm not saying that in sort of any kind of moral judgment, except that I am saying that about us as historians. And so our tendency to try to want to understand what brought these men together, and we focus so heavily upon the bonds of soldiering, as we should, and I certainly did that in my book. But what we continue to overlook is that there's coercion. And it's not just the kind of coercion that we're familiar with. And that is, you know, if you don't do your duty, you could face a court-martial, you could face some kind of punishment, you could face imprisonment, you could get shot. Yeah, that's all there. But coercion also imbued the very air that they breathed. And I'll say that goes back to this idea of being an elite unit. Right? You're part of the same community. You have a status as a man, and that status would come under question if you did not follow, uphold the orders that were given to you. To me, that's coercion at work. And so, you know, I've increasingly become, when I think about any military history that puts a value judgment on a unit's effectiveness in the field, if they're going to do it, let's be clear why we're making that point. It's because they killed better than their comrades. That's what they did.
Right. I think about that, Ben, and you don't have to call me Mr. Heckman. That's fine. John is fine. Just like Pete
Okay.
doesn't like when I call him
I'll call
Dr.
you Mr.
Carmichael.
Heckman now. Now that it bothers John, I'm gonna call Mr. Heckman.
Oh, here we go. I'll call you Dr. Carmichael then. I thought of that while you were saying that, Ben, when we look back on the Civil War with like the Iron Brigade. They chewed up a lot of Confederates along the Hagerstown Pike at Antietam. They killed a lot of men in the woods on McPherson's Ridge. They held out at Seminary Ridge. And like Pete said, it's elite units are the ones who seem to be able to slaughter the most people in front of them in a quick amount of time, usually even under extreme stress, because the Iron Brigade had extreme stress at Antietam. That's something that I've often thought about too, with when you're talking about units that are dependent upon to be there and hold the line. They get such names as the Iron Brigade because they hold the line, and other units in other wars. It's synonymous with a lot of other combat as well. You can see that the body count is higher with them than it is with other units. But you are starting to see this defense of corps or divisions like the 11th Corps at Gettysburg, like other units who fought in the First World War, where we're stacking it up with leadership quality now instead of the men along the line. And I'm starting to see that kind of a twist in there. And I'm wondering about that with the First World War, because I was talking to another First World War historian the other night, my friend James Taub, and we were talking about lions led by donkeys. And we were saying, is it really the Civil War was lions led by donkeys? Because we were having a big debate and a comparative history of our own. What do you think about something like that kind of a statement, saying that maybe it's the leadership we need to look at instead of just the men on the line being the elite ones? Maybe it's how they are put into the field.
I think leadership is crucial in kind of the creation of an elite unit. But talking about the lions led by donkeys in particular, I think it has a lot to do with the men themselves. And I kind of think there's a specific example of the 55th Division, the West Lancashire Division in the BEF. And they got a moderate to famous reputation as a dependable unit. But then they got kind of surprised in a counterattack at Cambrai, and they ended up running. And they got the reputation throughout the BEF as an undependable unit. And that kind of stuck with them, and it got in their heads. And to my knowledge, there wasn't a huge change in leadership organization or anything like that. But then in 1918, that stigma of having run and having broken, and that reputation that they gained throughout the Army, impelled them on to actually hold and make the difference in their part of the line during the German Spring Offensive of 1918. But I really don't think leadership can be the whole quality, because you look at the 11th Corps. They got their kind of bad reputation in the Valley, and but then they brought in Oliver Otis Howard. He was supposed to be the cure-all, right? Like, oh, he's coming from a good, dependable unit, the 2nd Corps. He'll come in and he'll make the difference. But I was reading an account by a guy in the 17th Connecticut, which was one of the American regiments in that corps. And he said that, the men have no confidence in Howard, and they won't fight well again until they get Sigel. So I think you can stress the commander, and the commander does often make the difference in an elite unit, but it also has a lot to do with the morale and the attitudes of the men, which I don't know if that kind of addresses your question about leadership, but that's just something I'm thinking about recently.
Let's ask I think the big and important question. And of course, I won't ask it as a question. I'll make a statement and tell me how you feel about it. And that is, what we're doing this evening is problematic. And we're trying to compare World War I to the Civil War. And it's apples and oranges. So, what can we actually learn from this comparison, if anything? And now I'll be specific. So, of late in Civil War studies, there's been an emphasis on what the war did to the common soldier. That Civil War soldier came out of this conflict, of course, he unscathed, right? And that he was a victim, right? And suffered from what we would call PTSD. In World War I, they might call it shell shock. And so I'm asking you now, Ben, does this comparison help us understand what the shock of battle did to men in the Civil War and World War I? Do we see similarities? Are there parallels? Are there differences? Or do you think we shouldn't make this comparison at all?
I think there are similarities and there are differences, but I think the value of the comparison itself is in the contrast it creates. Kind of to go back to the point that we kind of started with, is that going to these battlefields for me and working with the First World War for me isn't really in the value of a direct comparison in any of it. It's studying the First World War as its own event and studying the American Civil War as its own event, but gaining different, better, more interesting perspectives on both events because of studying those both. And I think that is really, when you're talking about the kind of trauma that's going on during the American Civil War and the kind of trauma that's going on during the First World War, it's intimately related to the cultural context in which it is occurring. And of course, this is the big debate about whether you can, retroactively diagnose PTSD, a modern condition with modern diagnostics, back into history. And I think the question is, just like the question, is it worthwhile to compare the First World War to the Civil War, is do you gain anything by comparing PTSD backward or the American Civil War to the First World War? Or is it better to just study the two as they are and then gain different perspectives from what we know about each one? And I think, it's just in the fact that you can study both and you can think about them. But I think trying to make a hard comparison between shell shock and soldier's heart and PTSD in the present is difficult, if not impossible. And I think the inquiry itself, like whether it's worthwhile, can be questioned. But I think studying all three and having a good understanding of all three in the cultural context that they occurred in, and then starting to contrast and thinking about new ways to come at the American Civil War or the First World War or PTSD.
I like a lot.
So
so I'm going to get even more specific, and then I'll turn it over to John. So here's what I'd like for you to explain to me and explain to my students in the 20th century world history class that I teach. In fact, it's the first class. I show them very disturbing footage of French soldiers suffering from shell shock. It's horrible. Bodies shaking uncontrollably. They're so jittery. I mean, you can just sense, right, that these men are still alive with fear. So, Ben, student asks you, this happened after World War I. Why is it that we don't have any record of Civil War soldiers having a similar physiological reaction to their experience in combat? I'm not suggesting that some Civil War soldiers did not show signs of what people would call shell shock in World War I, but I don't know of a single case, a single incident that describes men and the condition of that video of those French soldiers. Mm-hmm. So I think your point, we got to separate these things, but then help me still explain why. Why did that happen? Why didn't it happen during the Civil War? They both subscribe to the same ideas of manliness. They're all part of the same Victorian world. Help me understand, please.
Sure, yeah, and I think, once again, it has everything to do with the specific context of combat as it occurred on the Western Front. And I think it's called shell shock for the specific reasoning that the artillery bombardment that a First World War soldier, whether he's French, British, or German, is an incomparable experience to almost anything else in war. And it's definitely incomparable to anything that happened during the American Civil War. And I think it was a great discussion that John and James Taub had about combat in the First World War. And I think, as I said, that was one of the first things that stood out to me, is just how different the experience of combat was in the First World War to the American Civil War. And I think, once again, it speaks, mental trauma is a hard topic to talk about. And I can confess, I don't have total mastery of it at all. It's just like I don't have the total mastery of any of these things. I'm still just a callow undergrad. But
We,
I think
we none of us have total mastery. It's always an ongoing process. Anyone who thinks they've mastered it,
but I think
don't listen to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just say very quickly in
But-
turn to John, what you said, Ben, reminds me of my visit to Verdun, which was more powerful, more overwhelming than any other battlefield that I've ever visited. And the thing that, again, that is just hit home hard about the profound difference between World War I and the Civil War is the ordnance uh, and what the ordnance did to the landscape at Verdun. I mean, it's just filled with craters and towns obliterated. You just see the rubble, right, of villages. And then compare that to what looks like a golf fairway at Pickett's Charge. You know, a bombardment that lasted nearly an hour and a half, and there's no visible scar of that whatsoever. In fact, when I give my Pickett Charge walks, I show a photograph of Verdun so that people can, I think, get an appreciation for change over time, and that the soldier experience, I think, Ben, that's what you said so nicely. The soldier experience is not a universal one. And whenever we go in that direction, it's always a bad direction. I mean, we can talk about camaraderie, and yes, there's elements of it throughout time, but the essence of that camaraderie always changes, always changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we hit a trap too. This is just my opinion of it. When we're doing comparative histories from time to time, such as these, where we get into that trap of, is the Civil War the first modern war? I hate that question, but that's just me. I'm just like, to these guys, it was the most modern war ever. But to us, we can look back and say, well, is it the first modern war, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we get into a partial trap there where it's like, well, what is your idea of a modern war? And what's your idea of a cataclysmic war, such as we had in the mid 19th century with the Crimean War, the American Civil War, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering what your thought is on that question as a whole, though, Ben, because we've been talking about this violence on the Western Front and this overwhelming amount of artillery being thrown on each side, millions of shells in a number of hours. Yet the landscape is totally different than what we experience here in the States. And as Pete so eloquently put it, when you have a bombardment of an hour, there's going to be a lot more damage than we can ever see. So is that a disconnect maybe for us? Like, you went to the World War I sites and you had an immediate reaction to it. Some people go to Antietam and they think, well, this is too lovely to be a battlefield or something like that. What are your thoughts on that as far as how you perceive it when you first see it and try to understand that landscape?
I think it's incredibly powerful. As Dr. Carmichael said, you just see how torn up it all is, and you just get you immediately sense what must have been a terrible experience to actually endure the artillery bombardments that tore up that landscape. But you go to these First World War battlefields, they usually are just carved out of farmland because they occur in such rural places. They don't need to worry about encroachment as much as American Civil War battlefields do. But when you go to them, it's, farm fields, all of that. And then you come to the one place that's preserved, and it's just like carved up everywhere you go. The trenches are, and it's all torn to pieces and everything like that. And you get a little bit of that feeling that you get when you're at Petersburg, but it's very different, and you immediately understand how important the technology was that created all of this. But I think the other part that I would want to stress about First World War battlefields is the presence of cemeteries. That was the other thing that really stood out to me as I was walking from place to place, a couple miles apart. All of a sudden you would come to one of the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries, and they're all laid out in, the uniform fashion. All of the headstones are the same size. They all have the same cross. But you start to understand, as I said, how long and how costly these battlefields were, and how, every few weeks there was this level of tragedy that you have, 120 people in this cemetery. And then you walk another mile and there's another 120 people in this cemetery from different regiments and different communities, different dates of their death, sometimes multiple years apart on the Somme. So I think, and since it was all located in that one area, you get a good sense of just the war and how costly it was in totality. And those were the two things that stood out to me about the landscape.
So Ben, let me
on
ask
the
you
side.
let me ask you this question. I'm a massive fan of the historian Tim Snyder, who writes about the Holocaust. He has a number of books, Bloodlands being, I think, probably his most well-known title. He speaks about or writes about the problem of Auschwitz. The problem being is that people's understanding of the Holocaust today basically centers on Auschwitz, and that has led to grave distortions. So I won't go into the specifics, but I'm going to keep moving. Now, when we think about the Civil War, we're talking again about popular understandings. I'm going to say the problem of Pickett's charge. The problem being is that our understanding of Civil War leadership often centers on that hour or so on July 3rd of men being lined up in linear formations, little creativity, classic frontal attack, 50% casualties. That's what they did. That's what they continued to do. And now here comes the question. The problem of the Somme. You have suggested to us that these casualties, right, are sort of mind-boggling, and they continued, right? And it was sort of unrelenting. And now I'm going to bring John's point in there as well. Are you suggesting to us that the takeaway from the Somme is lions led by donkeys? Is that what we should understand about about the Somme?
Oh, no,
Yeah.
absolutely not. No, I really only meant to stress by that. That was my personal reaction as I went through, and I think that's more just a virtue, by virtue of conscious decisions made by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission after the war. But there's been a lot of really, really good scholarship talking about, just refuting the lions led by donkeys interpretation of the First World War, one that dominates popular understandings of the First World War.
So can you tell us a little bit about how tactics evolved? And Ben, I don't know if you've read this book before. We do a lot of show and tell here. Ernst Younger's Storm of Steel. Have you ever read it, Ben?
Oh yeah, of course.
Have you read it, John?
Yes, it's fantastic.
It's an incredible book.
It is.
It really is.
Everybody should put on the
Seminal word.
Yeah, no sense of disillusionment on Younger's part, right? At all. But he describes tactics very differently and what they became. And I don't know if you recall the specifics from this or from anyone else. I mean, how did the fighting evolve in the Somme? You're saying to me that they didn't continue to do these classic frontal attacks that were truly disastrous. How else? How did fighting evolve in World War One? Ben's going to the
counter your book with another book.
Let's see it. Which one is counter?
This is Patty Griffith, Battle Tactics of the Western Front.
I didn't know he did it.
And
yes,
the sea change for me, and I would recommend that.
Ben, could you hold that book up again?
Yeah,
sure.
So people, the viewers at home, can write it down.
There you go.
There you go.
Patty Griffith's Battle Tactics of the Western Front. This is one that showed up the other night in our discussion with James Taub. Go ahead, Ben.
And I think what's really, really important, if you're grounded in the American Civil War, you've probably already read Patty Griffith's Battle Tactics of the Civil War. And I would read that and then read Battle Tactics of the Western Front. And that is where my understanding of just how different two conflicts came from. And in particular, I wanted in this discussion to talk a lot about, how these units understood themselves in relation to other units. And the biggest difference between how an American Civil War soldier understood himself and a BEF soldier understood himself in the units he was in, the BEF soldier had so many more units to relate to, and therefore he kind of hated and had personal animosities towards so many other units because the war was just that much more complex. There was so much more artillery, and you had trench mortar batteries that were right up at the front. So infantry soldiers had a natural animosity towards trench mortar batteries. But then even with the platoon, you started dividing into smaller units. You had rifle guys who are just going to be, have their bayonets when we get in the trench, they're going to be going around the parapets. You had guys who were just bombers. These guys are just going to throw the grenades. And then you had a Lewis gun team. The army was just so much more subdivided and so much more specialized, almost on an industrial style scale. But what's interesting about Ernst Jünger and the Storm of Steel, he's definitely influenced American historiography quite a bit, that we tend to think of the stormtrooper as, you know, the quintessential, the peak of tactical ability on the Western Front. But in reality, and that's definitely the feeling you get from battle tactics of the Western Front, the British Army was just as proficient at those kind of, you know, infiltration tactics, the raiding tactics, and more oriented towards the offensive. And they were definitely stronger in that regard, working with bombardments and working with laying down machine gun fire. It was, yeah. So I would definitely recommend that book if you want to know more about what combat in the First World War, at least on the Western Front, was like.
You talked about the cemeteries as well, Ben. How do you see them as far as memory and commemoration is concerned? Because it seems that we just had this discussion the other night. When Americans think of the First World War, it's all over the top, gung ho kind of thing. But when you look at the BEF, it's very a somber looking statuaries and monuments and stuff like that. And our Civil War monuments can be a mixed bag as far as that's concerned. When these men are talking about their service and they're erecting monuments and they're preserving the memory of their comrades, how did you see the complexities involved with that?
Yeah, and the thing that struck me the most about British First World War commemoration is the emphasis on the unknown. The Cenotaph in London, which is kind of the premier First World War memorial, is an empty tomb. It's a tomb dedicated to an unknown soldier, and the cemeteries and the whole the poppy culture, it's all centered around the unknown soldier. And I think we have a sort of similar energy with American Civil War monuments and commemoration, but I don't think we see the same kind of emphasis on the unknown soldier that the British really brought out with theirs. But I think that might be one I kind of want to throw back to you guys and your understandings of the American Civil War, and John's ability to contrast with the First World War, and Dr. Carmichael's as well. Do you think we have the same sort of emphasis on the unknown soldier? And you know, what role does the unknown soldier play in American Civil War memory and memorialization?
That's a great question. Right. John, I'll let you go first.
I figured you're going to kick that to me first. You know, I really think that in historical memory, at least from my experience and when I've talked to people at interpretive events and such, we talk about the unknowns so much because there was no way to identify many of them to begin with. They didn't have the dog tags like we had in the First World War, et cetera. So it's almost a commonality, a common feature that you're going to have this issue. However, you don't really realize that until you go to national, military cemeteries, or you go to Richmond and you go to Hollywood Cemetery and there's a plot for the dead of Pickett's Charge, but you don't know who they are. I think that the issue is that we don't hit it too hard until we get to the burial sites, and then we kind of understand what the cost is. We don't see the Civil War memorials to the unknowns as like a sort of like, here lies an unknown soldier or anything like that, other than what we see with the Tomb of the Unknown at Arlington. That's what we think of when we think of the unknown soldier now. Americans think of that because of popular history. With the First World War, I've always been struck by how the British commemorate, and the British and the Canadians as well, commemorate the First World War dead, because it is centered a lot around those we've lost who we don't know what happened to them. And it's almost like a family member or a vacant chair thing with them. Like, it could be anyone's family member. It could be a vacant chair at anybody's home. It's a different kind of memorialization than we are used to in the United States. We are used to a lot of patriotic fervor and joys with having their freedoms, etc. And they're certainly happy to have their freedoms, but it's a more somber occasion in many of these places, right? So it's a very American, unique way of looking at our war dead than a lot of other countries that I've at least spoken with others, and I've been to other places and watched how they do a remembrance ceremony. It's a really different thing. And my big thing has always been our monuments always look more gung-ho, as we would say, than what we would see in a lot of other places.
So I'll say real quickly, and then I have another question for you, Ben. You can see evidence during the war in which the soldiers on both sides expressed a great deal of concern about identifying the dead. For example, when Sherman's men were marching back to Washington, D.C. at the end of the war, after the surrender at Bennett Place, they marched right through the battlefields around Fredericksburg. And I am struck by the great care that these men exhibited. For the most part, there were a few outfits in Sherman's command that had fought in the Chancellorsville area. But for almost all the other men, they did not have a comrade that was under that soil in Spotsylvania County. And so they were particularly aghast at how the bodies were treated. They saw that the civilians in the area had defiled them. And so there is a great concern to be able to try to identify men. In fact, I can remember one account of a unit that had returned, the 12th Corps unit, I believe, and they were able to locate where one of their officers was buried, and they disinterred him, put his remains in a box, and then of course shipped him back home for reinterment. So you see that concern. In the immediate post-war period, the cry to bring the bodies home from the South came mostly from women, from what would become ladies' memorial associations. So there's a concern there as well. I think it is all so locked into the question of reunion and reconciliation, because there's a growing awareness, even in the North, that if you just simply throw the Confederate dead in a pit and just leave them, that would not be a step toward reunion. So again, it doesn't have the same prominence, I agree with John, that one would find in World War I. So I'm going to go another sweeping generalization, one that I think most people make who even have, a solid understanding of the Civil War and World War I. I'll ask my question and then we'll get to some of the viewer questions. Ben, I think about the conclusion of the Civil War, and for Civil War veterans, particularly Northern veterans, for the most part, they came home. Hell, they're victorious. There's not a lot to complain about. They get, for the most part, a hero's welcome, and they proceed well into the 1880s, 1890s. They remembered their service, for the most part, as a heroic adventure, one in which the cause for which they gave, their lives, and their comrades, truly gave their lives, never to return, that they did it for a meaningful political cause and union. Whereas when we think of World War I, we think of sweeping demoralization, disillusionment, people who saw the human cost of World War I as a great waste without any purpose. Disillusionment, World War I, Civil War, a sense of purpose, a sense of achievement. The blood sacrifice was worth it. How do you like that generalization as a comparison? Is it a useful one? Yes or no?
I can't say I like it very much, and I don't think it's particularly useful, because it's just based off of kind of that war poet lens that we always tend to see the British soldier in the First World War through. And it's, if you go back on Armistice Day in 1918, nobody's moping around. There are some who are indeed disillusioned and disappointed, but there's widespread celebrations. People are happy that the war is over, and people are triumphant. The Allies have won. British soldiers are happy about the fact that they've won. There's mass celebrations in London. This was a victory for them. And then if you go back and you read a lot of the accounts that were written by, sort of the middle-brow, low-brow accounts of what it was like to be a soldier in the British Army during World War I in the 1920s, they're very, very different than the kind of interpretations you get in, Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, than you get from Wilfred Owen, kind of these famous names that we tend to associate with the First World War. They're triumphant. They're happy about what they've done. They believe that they've won the war for liberty, and what the causes that they set out for. They have defended Britain, which was their stated purpose. That kind of attitude and that disillusionment comes out of the cultural prominence and the cultural currency that the war poets attained. And also it's filtered through the Second World War, we know now that the First World War is the First World War. To them, it was the Great War. They didn't go around saying, "Oh, it's the First World War," but wait,
We know another one's coming around, right?
Yeah, we filter our understanding of the First World War through the Second World War. So for them, they understood their service as worthwhile. They said that they would go back and they would do it all again. And yeah, so that the belief that it produced an entire generation of moping poets is just incorrect. It's you have to go back to the sources, to what these guys were actually saying, what they actually believe.
Well, yeah, the discourse of those writers, of those poets, it certainly has captured the imagination.
Pervasive.
And I would say, here's again a book that I know you're familiar with and that John's familiar with.
Yeah,
right? Paul Fussell's work on the Great War. I mean, that is a book that has really stood the test of time. And I know that people punch holes in it and it's problematic in places, but nonetheless, it still is, I would argue, it still is an essential book and an important one, even if it doesn't hold up as well as one would like as well. John, do we have any questions from any of our viewers?
We have some questions that have to do with the AEF, which we'll probably have to get back to later because we were talking about the BEF. But there was one that was about when these men get home. Do you have any commonality in your research, Ben, as far as how they overcame their experiences? And I think that leads back to like the shell shock and the post-traumatic issues that we were talking about earlier. But have you seen any commonality with how some men just kind of quote move on with life, or they have to overcome what they've been through and do it in various ways? Do you see any of that with BEF versus the Civil War veteran? Or is that too much of a blanket?
One commonality I can the one commonality I can speak to is just the fact that most veterans did not end up joining, unit organizations, veteran organizations. That's kind of the statistic that goes around, that most Union veterans, of course, didn't join GAR, and I believe most BEF veterans didn't end up joining any unit or veteran organizations. But unit and veteran organizations did exist among British soldiers after the First World War, but they didn't have the kind of widespread membership. But once again, it just goes to the gulf of cultural and the cultural difference between post-war Britain and post-war America. These are just two very different places, but that's the one similarity I can think of off the top of my head. Well, thoughts?
Yeah. I had another question for you here from one of our viewers, Ben, actually. That's does the scale of civic destruction affect the attitudes towards the war? Which is a really great question. Obviously, we had no civic destruction in the U.S. during the First World War, as was said in the comment, and Europe was ravaged. But we have destruction here in the Civil War, obviously.
Yeah, I think that definitely does make a difference, and in particular, it's going to make a difference to people in the South. Differences in the way that the UDC went about it, but I think it'd be interesting to look into kind of thinking about how just the fact that Britain was relatively didn't suffer a lot of damage. There were some Zeppelin bombings in the North, of course, other than Chambersburg, and the Gettysburg campaign didn't suffer a lot of civic destruction. I think that might be a useful one to look into, but yeah, that definitely is going to influence the common soldier's experience of the war and the way it's remembered. But I can't say that. Yeah, it's tough.
I think one interesting avenue, and it's a student here, a former student who's interested in this question, and that is the turn to reactionary politics amongst former German World War I veterans, right? He survived the war and who will, of course, end up in engaging in a number of reactionary parties, obviously some in the Nazi Party as well. And to make that comparison to what Jim Broomall has done, and I think has done brilliantly, is to look at Confederate soldiers in the immediate post-war period who turned to vigilante justice or to the Klan. So I think there's, again, some interesting comparisons. I've been to sort of wrap this up. I think you said very nicely for all of us that these comparisons, although they're not perfect, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't move ahead with it. And I mentioned Ian Isherwood's piece I think at our last talk. It's in the Journal of the Civil War Era, which again, one could subscribe to this. University of North Carolina is giving a 40% discount. This might apply to it, but if you can't, you can certainly get it at your library. And there's a piece that Ian wrote, and it compares World War I and the Civil War. When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, service, suffering, and survival of Civil War and Great War veterans. That's quite a title. But I think, one of Ian's many points is just because that comparison is an imperfect alignment, that doesn't mean that it can't result, I think, in some deep insights that can be drawn from both sides. Ben, we're so pleased that you joined us, and I want to remind the audience, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, Chancellorsville Wilderness, where Stonewall Jackson died. Ben Roy will be there this summer, starting somewhere in June. He doesn't know his duty stations, as they call it, yet. I don't know them either, but certainly get out there and get on one of his walking tours as well. And Ben, when you graduate next year, what I'm going to give you, I already know, and you know too, what I'm going to give you is your parting gift. And it's right behind me up on my top shelf. That is a family heirloom, that nun. And Ben made fun of it one day. He said it was possessed and that I should be looking over my shoulder. Kind of freaked me out. It was always a source of comfort to me until Ben, of course. So it's yours now, Ben. And of course, anything happens to it, you'll have to deal with the guilt of knowing that your advisor gave it to you, right?
Yes.
An heirloom gave it to you. And the last thing, Ben and John, I don't know if you have any other recommendations. I do.
Sure,
Ben, come on, man. On that back wall, you got Old Abe. John, who should be right next to Old Abe? Franklin Pierce? Who else?
Franklin, yeah.
You got to stand by your man. Franklin should be on that wall.
There you go. There you go. We can put the nun up there.
We'll put the nun between Franklin
I was
and
about to say.
Yeah.
I don't think you're giving me anything. I think you're cursing me. I think there are some
Ben, that
you
hurts.
need to watch.
John.
No. There are some horror movies that you need to watch that I think you'll understand the burden of what you're giving me.
John, you invest in these students, you give all you can. Hell, you ignore your own children for them, and then they say, you're trying to curse me.
Yeah. So this is what I have to learn before I go into the classroom, right? That's what I do. I think the nun is a great thing, though. It's got a light coming down on her. You can see it there. It's angelic.
It is. Ben we have two more students who will be coming on the show before our time is done. And they'll be coming in the month of May. And as our audiences have seen with Cameron and now with Ben, you know what? I'm damn lucky. I've got really good students. They're just seeing 4 of them. I have many others. They're smart, they're energetic, and guess what? They're coachable, right? They want to learn. They don't think they know it all. And it's just a joy to be around them. I'm going to miss the hell out of Cameron and Ben. He got Carolyn coming up and Erica. It is rewarding. And above all else, man, it's why I got into this business. It's to be able to connect with really smart, young, ambitious people. So again, go see Mr. Roy out at Fredericksburg this summer. And don't forget to tell your parents, $10 coupon off, General Pickett's Tattoo Shop. Hell, John and I will come with you.
Yeah, it's cash only, no charge. No charge at Pickett's.
I'll get the nun.
Yeah.
I'll get a tattoo.
We'll bring the nun with us.
Yeah. Hey, I just want to say.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ben. Go please. Go right ahead.
I just want to say thank you guys both very much for having me. Thank you for all the kind sentiments, Dr. Carmichael. And once again, thank you for all your help with Colby and the Beinecke, so on and so forth. I literally would not be here without you, but I don't know how thankful I can be.
Well, you still have senior seminar next fall, so we're not quite to the finish line. One more hurdle.
He's working on that grade right now.
So we have John on Thursday, Professor Brian Lusky from the University of West Virginia, right? Yes. WVU, Co-Mountaineers. We will be talking about Brian's book, right? Men is Cheap. It is a fantastic book. And I think our audience will be shocked to learn about the many sordid activities that were occurring inside the Army, outside the Army. And when I say the Army, I'm talking about the Northern War effort. They're fascinating stories, powerful stories, And it's all part of the move in the field right now, so that we don't see the war for union and emancipation, that we don't just frame it in heroic terms, that we capture all aspects of it, even the ones that are, like I said, pretty unseemly and pretty sordid. So Brian Muskie, 7 o'clock Thursday, and hope to see you all then.
That's right. Thank you all for all of your comments. I'm sure we'll get to them in the next 24 hours. We'll get back through them because I think there's a couple hundred that we have to go through. Maybe we'll get Ben in there to answer some of them because
he's just in finals week right now. He's got time for this.
He's got time.
Yeah,
he can. Finals week. I mean, it's not like you're sitting in class right now. I mean, come on. You're in front of the computer anyway. You might as well just click and open another window and just answer some questions. But no, thank you all for tuning in. Ben, thank you so much, man. And congratulations on everything that you've accomplished so far. And I'm sure you're going to go a great distance with everything. And I'm really proud to say you're a friend of mine. And it's been great to have you on, man.
All right. Take care, y'all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody. See you Thursday.